It was an ordinary sunny afternoon in the city, with people going about their daily routines, unaware that something extraordinary was about to happen. The streets were busy, cars honking, and the occasional cyclist weaving through traffic, but everything seemed normal. Suddenly, the calm of the day was shattered by the roar of an expensive sports car speeding around a sharp corner. The car, sleek and shiny, belonged to one of the wealthiest men in the city, a billionaire known for his charm, wealth, and larger-than-life personality. He was returning from a private meeting, unaware that a moment of carelessness would soon turn his day upside down. As he accelerated, a sudden distraction caught his attention, a pedestrian crossing too quickly, a dog running into the street, or maybe even a brief thought about a business deal. Whatever the reason, his reflexes weren't enough to prevent disaster. The car swerved violently, tires screeching against the asphalt, drawing gasps from nearby onlookers. People stopped in their tracks, some pointing, others pulling out their phones to capture the chaos. The world seemed to slow down for a moment, the car spinning slightly, bumping against the curb, before finally coming to a sudden halt, leaving a cloud of dust and tension in its wake. Passers-by rushed over immediately, some calling emergency services, others checking for injuries. The air was filled with a mix of panic, fear, and curiosity. The billionaire's body lay slumped in the driver's seat, motionless, his expensive suit slightly crumpled, a small scratch on his cheek. The scene looked serious, perhaps even life-threatening, but at that moment, no one knew the full story. Neighbors peeked out of windows, and nearby shopkeepers stepped outside, their faces a mixture of shock and concern. The sound of approaching sirens added urgency, but before the paramedics arrived, something unusual happened. Amid the chaos, a few people tried to get closer, asking questions, trying to see if he was breathing, if he was conscious. Some attempted to open the car door, fearing the worst. The billionaire's personal driver, a loyal employee who had served him for years, arrived moments later, his face pale, hands trembling, unsure what to do first. He called out the billionaire's name repeatedly, shaking his shoulder gently, but received no response. The tension grew. Spectators whispered to one another, speculating about the severity of the accident and imagining the worst. But behind the apparent stillness, something unusual was happening. The billionaire, despite the accident, was fully aware of everything around him. He could hear the murmurs of concern, the voices of bystanders, and the rapid footsteps of his driver approaching. He felt the vibrations of panic in the air. But instead of reacting, he chose to remain still, feigning unconsciousness. It was not out of fear or injury, but curiosity, and perhaps a hint of mischief. He wanted to see who would act with honesty, who would panic, and who might try to take advantage of the situation. While he lay there, the street around him had turned into a small stage of human behavior. Strangers offered assistance, some genuinely concerned, others hesitant, unsure whether they should get involved. A few children watched from a distance, holding the hands of their parents, eyes wide with fascination. Car horns blared, pedestrians shouted, and yet, in the midst of all this noise, the billionaire remained silent, observing the reactions of everyone around him. Moments later, a crowd began to gather. People speculated about who the man was, recognizing him as one of the richest men in the city. Some whispered about the wealth he had, the power he wielded, and even the mistakes he might have made to end up in such a situation. Others worried simply about his life, hoping he would be okay. Little did they know, the billionaire had seen and heard it all before. But what he did not anticipate was the arrival of someone who would change the entire dynamic of the scene, a person whose presence would cut through the chaos with honesty and insight, setting the stage for events that no one could have predicted. Until then, the scene remained a tense mix of fear and curiosity. The accident itself, though minor in physical damage, had become the starting point for something much larger, a story about human reactions, integrity, and unexpected truths. And while the car sat still, the city seemed to hold its breath, waiting for the next moment, the next reaction, the next voice that would turn a simple accident into an unforgettable story. Even as the crowd gathered, staring at the crumpled car and the seemingly unconscious billionaire, no one realized that what they were witnessing was not entirely real. Beneath the calm, motionless exterior, the billionaire's mind was racing. He was fully aware of every voice, every step, every whisper. The honking cars, the murmurs of bystanders, the worried tone of his driver, he absorbed it all like a hidden observer, sitting at the center of a human experiment. He wasn't hurt, at least, not seriously, but he had chosen this moment deliberately, to feign unconsciousness. It wasn't just a random whim. In his world of wealth and power, he had grown accustomed to people telling him what he wanted to hear, smiling when expected, nodding in agreement, and often hiding the truth. For years, he had wondered how many around him were loyal, how many spoke honestly, and how many were simply performing for his benefit. Today, by pretending to be unconscious, he could see people's true reactions, raw, unfiltered, and honest. He wanted to know who genuinely cared and who only acted out of fear, obligation, or self-interest. From inside the car, he noticed the subtle gestures of those closest to him. His driver, a man who had served him for nearly a decade, was pacing anxiously, muttering under his breath, and checking the billionaire's pulse repeatedly. The driver's worry was genuine, but there was also a trace of panic, a hint of fear for what might happen if his employer was seriously injured. Then there were the onlookers, some whispering guesses about the accident, others peeking into the car, curiosity etched on their faces. Everyone had a story about the billionaire, everyone had an opinion, but very few had the courage to speak directly. As minutes passed, the billionaire began to feel a sense of satisfaction. He observed how easily people judged appearances, how quick they were to assume, and how hesitant they were to challenge the obvious. Yet amid all the noise and concern, one figure approached with something entirely different, a calm, focused presence. It was the Black Maid, known for her straightforward nature, intelligence, and unshakable honesty. She had been serving the billionaire for several years, but unlike most, she never flattered, never bowed to status, and never let fear dictate her words. She walked toward the scene with purpose, seemingly unfazed by the crowd or the sirens in the distance. The billionaire watched, intrigued. There was something magnetic about her confidence, something that suggested she would not be swayed by appearances or pretense. While others hesitated, she stepped closer, examining the situation with clear eyes, and prepared to speak, not with panic, not with false concern, but with something far more profound, truth. Inside the car, the billionaire's mind raced. He had anticipated fear, confusion, maybe even exaggerated concern, but he hadn't expected honesty to arrive so boldly, so directly, so early. His decision to feign unconsciousness was already proving more revealing than he could have imagined. Every gesture, every word, every pause in the unfolding moment was now a piece of the puzzle he had been longing to solve. Yet there was also a thrill in the act of deception itself. For the first time in a long while, he experienced the strange power of invisibility, of being present but unseen, noticed but not fully recognized. People revealed their instincts, their true characters, and even their hidden motives, without knowing they were being observed. The billionaire felt like a silent conductor of a grand orchestra, listening to every note of human behavior, every subtle change in emotion. And while he played this hidden role, the stakes of the situation began to grow higher. What if someone misinterpreted his stillness? What if the crowd reacted in panic, or the driver made a mistake in the rush to help? The thrill of control mingled with a hint of danger, creating a tension that was impossible to ignore. Every second was a test, not just for those outside the car, but for himself. Could he remain composed? Could he observe without revealing the truth too soon? Little did he know, the next words spoken would not only pierce the tension but also challenge everything he believed about loyalty, honesty, and human insight. The maid's arrival marked the first true turning point, a moment where feigned weakness would collide with unflinching honesty, setting the stage for revelations that would change the billionaire's perspective forever. And so, as he remained motionless, observing, listening, and calculating, the billionaire understood that this simple accident was no longer just an accident, it was a mirror, reflecting the real character of everyone around him, and perhaps even the hidden corners of his own soul. While the crowd hovered around the car, whispering and pointing, the black maid approached with a calm confidence that immediately set her apart. She moved quickly but deliberately, her steps measured, as if she were walking through a storm yet entirely untouched by it. Unlike everyone else, she didn't gasp, shout, or panic. She didn't fumble with her phone or frantically wave for help. Instead, she observed the scene like a person who had seen enough of life to know what truly mattered. Her eyes scanned the crowd first. Some bystanders stepped back, intimidated by her presence, while others watched curiously, sensing that she was not just another person caught in the chaos. She didn't rush to the billionaire's side like the driver or the neighbors. She waited for the right moment, for the right approach, as if she understood that timing was as important as action. There was authority in her silence, a quiet power that drew attention without demanding it. From inside the car, the billionaire's eyes followed her every movement. Even though he remained perfectly still, feigning unconsciousness, he felt a jolt of curiosity and intrigue. He had expected concern, fear, or maybe exaggerated sympathy from the people around him, but he had not expected someone to approach the situation with such clarity and focus. This maid, someone he had known for years, was different. There was no flattery in her step, no hidden motive in her gaze. She was coming forward because she wanted to speak the truth, nothing more, nothing less. As she reached the car, she didn't kneel or check for injuries in the way others might have. Instead, she stood upright, her eyes fixed on the billionaire's face, and spoke in a calm but firm voice. Her words were simple, direct, and astonishingly honest. The crowd fell silent, sensing that something significant was about to happen. Even the driver paused, unsure of how to respond, feeling the weight of the maid's presence and the sharpness of her observation. "Sir," she said, her tone neither fearful nor aggressive, "you are pretending. And everyone here is playing a part in this charade." The billionaire's mind raced. He had expected shock, questions, maybe even outrage, but not this. She had seen through his act immediately, reading the subtle signs he had tried to hide, the slight tension in his hands, the uneven breathing, the faint twitch of his eyelids. Most people would never have noticed, but she did, and more importantly, she didn't hesitate to say it aloud. Her honesty was like a mirror, reflecting back the truth he had tried to mask. The crowd murmured among themselves, some laughing nervously, others gasping in disbelief. The billionaire felt a mix of surprise and admiration. No one else had the courage, or perhaps the insight, to speak the truth so boldly, especially in front of an audience of strangers. He realized that she wasn't just a maid in the traditional sense, she was a person who understood human nature, who could see beyond appearances, and who valued honesty above social convention or fear. He continued to lie still, observing her reactions, noting her calm posture, the confidence in her voice, and the unwavering clarity of her gaze. The dynamic of the scene shifted instantly. Where there had been chaos, confusion, and superficial concern, now there was focus, respect, and attention. The maid had taken control, not by force, but by presence, by insight, and by speaking a truth that no one else had dared to say. For the billionaire, the experience was both thrilling and humbling. He had planned this little experiment to test others, to see who would reveal their true selves, but he hadn't anticipated that the very person closest to him, someone he had seen every day, would be the first to do so. There was a lesson hidden in her honesty, one that he could not ignore. The way she navigated the crowd, assessed the situation, and spoke with authority taught him something he hadn't realized he needed to learn. True insight doesn't come from wealth, position, or experience, it comes from courage and clarity of mind. As the sirens grew louder, and paramedics began to arrive on the scene, the billionaire's thoughts were no longer about himself. They were about her, the maid who had seen through the facade, who had refused to play along, and who had spoken the truth in a way that silenced the chaos around them. Her arrival had changed the entire story of the accident, transforming it from a simple scene of panic into a stage where honesty, courage, and integrity shone brighter than wealth or fear. And at that moment, even as the crowd continued to whisper and speculate, the billionaire understood that this encounter, the maid's arrival and her fearless truth, would be remembered far longer than the accident itself. It was a turning point, a moment that would alter his perception of loyalty, honesty, and human insight forever. The air around the car grew still as the black maid's gaze locked onto the billionaire's face. The crowd, sensing a shift, instinctively hushed themselves, leaning in as if expecting something extraordinary to happen. Her presence had already changed the energy at the scene, but it was the words she spoke next that would leave everyone, especially the billionaire, stunned. She didn't fumble, she didn't plead, and she didn't exaggerate. Instead, she spoke with clarity, conviction, and a calmness that made every word resonate like a bell cutting through the chaos. "You are not hurt," she said firmly, her eyes unwavering. "You are pretending. You always act, don't you? You hide behind wealth, behind appearances, behind fear and power. But today, everyone sees who they truly are, and so do you." The billionaire felt a shiver run down his spine. Her words were more than an observation, they were a mirror held up to his life, reflecting truths he had long ignored. No one had ever confronted him like this, not with flattery, not with fear, not even with honesty. Yet she did it casually, naturally, without drama, and in doing so, she exposed the complexity of the situation in a way that no one else could. The crowd murmured. Some laughed nervously, thinking she was being bold, others gasped, shocked that a servant dared to speak so directly to someone of such wealth. The driver, who had been frantic moments ago, froze, realizing that the maid had said what everyone was thinking but none had dared to speak aloud. It was not disrespect, it was clarity. Her words pierced through the pretense like a blade, and in the quiet that followed, the billionaire felt an unexpected weight settle on his chest. For years, he had surrounded himself with people who nodded, smiled, and echoed the words he wanted to hear. He had assumed loyalty could be measured by obedience, kindness by flattery, and honesty by careful phrasing. But here, in front of dozens of strangers, someone had stripped away all the layers. The maid's words were not just commentary, they were a challenge. A challenge to see himself, to see his life, and to confront the truths he had avoided for too long. He remained still, feigning unconsciousness, yet internally, he was reeling. Each phrase she spoke felt like a revelation. She didn't just comment on the act of pretending, she spoke to the billionaire's entire way of living. The pretense, the masks, the games he had played with others and himself, they all seemed suddenly obvious under her piercing honesty. He had expected to test the people around him, but in an unexpected twist, he was the one being tested. And the more she spoke, the more precise and fearless her words became. She spoke of respect, of integrity, of the fleeting nature of appearances. She reminded him that wealth could conceal many things but could never hide truth. "Power without honesty is nothing," she said, her voice steady, echoing through the stillness of the street. "People follow the person who is real, not the person who pretends to be everything. Even you cannot escape that reality." The billionaire's mind raced. He had carefully orchestrated this moment, believing himself to be the observer, the master of the scene. Yet, in a strange reversal, the maid had taken control. Every onlooker now sensed it, her courage, her clarity, and her unwavering commitment to honesty had shifted the dynamic completely. The accident, once chaotic and dramatic, now felt like a carefully staged lesson on human behavior, morality, and perception. Time seemed to stretch as the maid continued. Her words were simple but profound, each sentence layered with insight. The billionaire, still motionless, realized that what he had initially planned as a test of others had transformed into a confrontation with his own character. Her honesty had broken through his armor of wealth, status, and control. Finally, as she finished speaking, silence fell. The crowd held its breath, unsure how to react, sensing the weight of what had just occurred. The billionaire remained still for a few more moments, absorbing every word, every nuance. Then, slowly, a small part of him shifted, a recognition that this moment, this black maid's courage and insight, would change more than just the story of an accident. It would change him, and perhaps the way he saw everyone around him. In that moment, the billionaire realized something profound. True power was not in wealth, nor in influence, nor even in appearances. True power was in honesty, courage, and the ability to speak the truth, even when it was inconvenient, uncomfortable, or daring. And it was here, amid the smoke of tires, the whispers of the crowd, and the aftermath of a simple accident, that he first glimpsed what real insight, and real transformation, could look like. Even as the maid's words lingered in the air, the billionaire remained perfectly still, his eyes closed, his body slack, giving the impression of unconsciousness. Yet inside, his mind was alive with a whirlwind of emotions, thoughts, and realizations he hadn't expected. Shock, admiration, guilt, and curiosity collided in his mind like crashing waves, each one forcing him to rethink the carefully constructed world he had always inhabited. He had pretended to be unconscious to test the reactions of those around him, to observe honesty, loyalty, and fear firsthand. But the maid, someone he had seen every day, someone he had believed he understood completely, had pierced through his act within moments. Her words were precise, fearless, and unwavering. She had exposed truths he had long avoided facing. For the first time, he realized that the person he had thought he was testing was the one being examined instead. Inside him, a quiet, almost unnoticeable shift began. He felt the heat of embarrassment creep into his chest, a reminder that his wealth, his status, and his calculated control could not shield him from honesty. Her words had touched something deeper, something real. It wasn't anger or shame alone, it was recognition. Recognition that this accident, this chaotic moment, was no longer just about the physical crash or the reactions of the crowd, it was about him, and the life he had been living behind walls of privilege and pretense. He observed the crowd through half-open eyes. The whispers, the glances, the cautious gestures, they all faded into the background. Nothing mattered except the maid's voice, the clarity of her gaze, and the truth in her words. For years, he had believed his wealth made him untouchable, that his status insulated him from judgment. Yet here was someone who didn't care about his fortune, his title, or his influence. She cared about honesty, integrity, and courage. And that care, so unfiltered and direct, struck him harder than any car accident ever could. In that moment, he began to reflect. He thought of the countless times he had relied on appearances, on flattery, on manipulation. He remembered the employees who said yes when they wanted to say no, the friends who smiled while hiding resentment, the family members who nodded without speaking their minds. All of them had played roles in his life, and he had accepted it without question. But the maid's words had disrupted the script entirely. She didn't play along. She had refused to perform, and the result was a truth he could not ignore. Yet alongside the admiration, there was another, subtler feeling, gratitude. Gratitude not for kindness or praise, but for courage. Courage to speak, to stand, and to confront someone of unimaginable wealth without flinching. Courage to see what others ignored, to pierce through the fog of status and fear, and to deliver honesty when it mattered most. The billionaire realized that her courage was rare, and that rarity made it priceless. He also began to feel a strange excitement, a sense of awakening that he hadn't felt in years. For all the power, money, and influence he possessed, this was the first time someone had challenged him with truth rather than obedience. And in that challenge lay an opportunity, a chance to learn, to grow, and to see the world, and himself, differently. The realization was thrilling and terrifying all at once. Internally, he smiled faintly, a private acknowledgement of the lesson unfolding before him. Outwardly, he remained still, giving no hint to the crowd that he had heard everything, that he had understood, that he was alive and fully aware. The act of feigning unconsciousness had served its purpose, it had revealed character, both of those around him and, most importantly, of himself. Finally, he knew that this was only the beginning. The maid's words were not just a moment, they were a spark. A spark that would ignite reflection, change, and perhaps even transformation. For the first time in a long time, he felt the raw truth of life, that wealth could buy many things, but it could never buy honesty, courage, or integrity. Those had to be recognized, respected, and learned, and he had just been taught one of life's most important lessons. As he prepared to reveal himself, to end the charade, he knew that the coming moments would be critical. The world outside the car had shifted because of the maid, because of her honesty, because of her courage. And now, the billionaire, once hidden behind pretense, would confront the consequences of that honesty, not with anger, but with awareness, respect, and perhaps the first true humility he had ever felt. The crowd had started to settle, the initial panic fading into a tense silence. The sirens in the distance had grown louder, yet the focus of everyone around the car was no longer the accident itself, it was the silent, still billionaire and the maid who had dared to speak the truth. She stood tall, calm, and composed, her eyes steady, while he lay motionless inside, fully aware but carefully maintaining his act. But now, something was shifting inside him. For the first time in years, the billionaire allowed himself to truly reflect on what had happened. The accident, which had seemed like a minor disruption at first, had become a mirror for his life. He realized that he had spent decades surrounded by people who nodded, smiled, and agreed with him, not because they wanted to, but because it was expected. Loyalty had often been measured by obedience, kindness by flattery, and honesty had been a rarity. Yet here, before him, stood someone who ignored status entirely, someone who saw truth and spoke it with courage. The clarity of the moment struck him. He thought about the choices he had made, the relationships he had cultivated, and the illusions he had created around himself. How often had he judged people based on their words instead of their actions? How many times had he believed appearances rather than reality? The maid's boldness had stripped all of that away. In one simple, fearless statement, she had revealed what was real and what was performative in his world. He could no longer pretend that wealth and power were the measures of worth. The revelation settled heavily in his mind. Integrity, honesty, and courage were far more valuable than money, influence, or prestige. And those were qualities that could not be bought, inherited, or faked, they had to be recognized and respected. The realization was uncomfortable but liberating, a mixture of humility and admiration that he had rarely felt in his life. He also reflected on himself. Pretending to be unconscious had been his way of testing others, but the true lesson came back to him. He had underestimated the maid, as he had often underestimated people who didn't bow to status or wealth. She had seen through the act immediately, identifying the subtleties he thought he could hide. The experience forced him to confront his own arrogance, his assumption that appearances could control reality, and his belief that everyone would respond predictably to him. The longer he lay there, the more he appreciated the depth of the lesson. He thought about how little he had paid attention to honesty in its purest form, how little he had valued those who spoke truth, even when inconvenient. The maid had not only pointed out his pretense but had also reminded him of the importance of listening, observing, and learning. Her courage had created a space for reflection, and he could no longer ignore it. Outside, the crowd had begun to murmur again, realizing that this was no ordinary accident. Their whispers spoke of courage, honesty, and unexpected lessons. But the billionaire's focus was entirely on the maid. He saw clarity in her gaze, authenticity in her stance, and a strength he had never seen before. She had challenged him without confrontation, changed the energy of the scene, and left an indelible mark on his consciousness. In that moment of revelation, the billionaire understood that life was not measured by the wealth he possessed or the power he commanded, but by the honesty he recognized and the courage he respected. He understood that pretense and deception might protect him temporarily, but truth had the power to reveal, teach, and transform. And the maid, standing quietly yet confidently, had given him exactly that, a mirror of reality he could no longer ignore. He knew that the accident, the charade, and the maid's words would stay with him forever. It was more than a lesson, it was a turning point. And as he prepared to move, to finally reveal that he had been awake and aware all along, he felt a sense of gratitude unlike anything he had ever known. Gratitude for truth, gratitude for courage, and gratitude for someone brave enough to speak it without fear. The billionaire understood something profound. The real revelation wasn't about the accident or the act of feigning unconsciousness. The real revelation was about seeing the world clearly, seeing people clearly, and most importantly, seeing himself clearly for the first time. The air had changed around the car. The whispers of the crowd had softened into a cautious silence, as if everyone sensed something rare and important was unfolding. The billionaire, still lying motionless, could feel it too. The weight of the maid's words and the clarity of her presence had shifted the dynamic entirely. For the first time, he felt the need to respond, not with pretense, not with manipulation, but with genuine acknowledgement. Slowly, he moved, letting the crowd realize he was no longer unconscious. The tension was immediate. Gasps and murmurs spread like wildfire. The driver stumbled backward, unsure how to react, while onlookers leaned forward, straining to see the man they had assumed was injured. But the billionaire's attention was fixed solely on the maid, whose calm and steady gaze had never wavered. She didn't flinch, didn't bow, didn't step back. She was the eye of the storm, the anchor in the chaos. Finally, he opened his mouth, his voice low, measured, and careful. "You were right," he said. "Everything you said, every word, it's true." His confession surprised even him. Admitting it out loud felt strangely liberating, almost foreign, yet utterly necessary. He had lived a life of appearances, of control, of performance. But now, faced with honesty in its purest form, he could no longer hide behind pride or fear. The maid tilted her head slightly, listening. She didn't smile, didn't soften her expression. Her eyes reflected quiet authority, as if she had expected this acknowledgement all along. "Actions matter more than words," she said simply, "and honesty matters more than appearances. The world may reward wealth and power, but only integrity and courage leave a lasting mark." The billionaire felt the weight of her words sink in. He thought of the countless years he had spent chasing influence, surrounding himself with yes-men and flattering acquaintances. He realized now that he had often mistaken loyalty for fear, admiration for obedience. And in that moment, he understood something profound. True respect is earned through integrity, not wealth. True power lies not in dominance, but in recognition of honesty and courage. Without thinking, he stepped closer to her, careful to avoid making a scene yet unable to suppress the urgency in his movements. "I need to understand," he said softly. "I need to learn how to be better, not just for myself, but for everyone around me. For the people who serve, for the people I influence, for those who deserve truth, not pretense." She studied him for a moment, as if weighing his sincerity. Then, finally, she nodded. Her acceptance was subtle, but it carried enormous weight. It was not praise, nor flattery, it was recognition of his willingness to confront himself, to see the truth, and to begin a transformation he had long resisted. The turning point was not just the billionaire's acknowledgement, but the shift in their relationship. For the first time, he was seeing her not merely as a maid or employee, but as a person whose insight and courage demanded respect. Around them, the crowd began to relax, sensing the end of the charade. The tension that had gripped the street gradually eased, replaced by a quiet sense of awe. What had started as an accident and a performance had transformed into a lesson on humanity, morality, and the unexpected power of truth. People whispered about courage, honesty, and the unusual bond forming between a billionaire and someone society might overlook. Inwardly, the billionaire reflected on the subtle but powerful lesson of this encounter. The turning point wasn't just about admitting he had been feigning unconsciousness. It was about understanding the value of honesty, the rarity of courage, and the way a single, fearless person could illuminate truths that wealth, power, and status often obscure. Finally, he took a deep breath, feeling the heaviness in his chest ease slightly. He realized that life would never be the same again. The accident had been a catalyst, the maid's words a mirror, and this moment, their confrontation, a spark that would ignite real change in him. He felt a quiet gratitude, not just for the lesson, but for the courage to confront it, for the willingness to see clearly, and for the first glimpse of what true humility could feel like. And so, standing there amidst the aftermath of the accident, the whispers of the crowd, and the hum of the city, the billionaire and the maid shared a silent understanding. This was more than acknowledgement, it was transformation. The turning point had arrived, and neither of them would ever forget it. The accident was over, the crowd had dispersed, and the city had returned to its usual rhythm, yet for the billionaire, nothing would ever be the same again. The charade of feigned unconsciousness had ended, but the lesson it brought lingered like a quiet storm inside him. The maid's words, spoken with such courage and clarity, had left a mark far deeper than any physical injury could have, reshaping his perspective on loyalty, honesty, and human character. He sat quietly in his car for a long moment, reflecting on everything he had witnessed and heard. The bustling city outside seemed distant now, a world of noise and distraction that no longer mattered. What mattered was truth, the raw, unfiltered honesty of someone unafraid to speak it. The realization settled in him that wealth and power, which he had spent so long cultivating, were fragile and fleeting. Integrity and courage, by contrast, endured. They left impressions that no money could buy, lessons that no privilege could erase. From that day onward, he approached life differently. The first change was subtle, he began noticing people he had previously ignored. The receptionist who greeted him daily with a quiet smile, the assistant who always offered careful advice, the staff who worked behind the scenes, all of them became more than background figures. He listened to them, asked questions, and, more importantly, sought their honesty. Where once he had relied on appearances and flattery, he now valued truth, even when it was uncomfortable. The relationship with the maid deepened in ways he had never anticipated. She became a trusted advisor, not because of position or wealth, but because she had earned it through courage and insight. Their conversations shifted from routine tasks to matters of principle, integrity, and human behavior. He began to see her as a teacher in the truest sense, someone who illuminated the parts of life that money could never reach, someone who reminded him that even a billionaire could learn humility. Professionally, the impact was equally profound. Decisions he had once made to maintain appearances or preserve power were now reconsidered with clarity. He started treating employees with respect, recognizing the value of honesty over blind obedience. Meetings became discussions, not performances. Collaboration replaced intimidation. The lessons of the accident, the maid's words, and his own hidden observations transformed the way he led and lived. Even socially, he noticed subtle but important changes. Friends who had only complimented or agreed were now evaluated based on authenticity. He sought relationships built on truth, understanding, and mutual respect rather than convenience or flattery. The billionaire began to appreciate that wealth alone could not guarantee meaningful connections, only honesty and integrity could. Most importantly, the incident changed how he viewed himself. For the first time, he embraced vulnerability, not weakness, but openness to learning, to criticism, to seeing reality without the filters of pride or ego. The act of feigning unconsciousness had been intended as a test of others, but in the end, it became a test of his own character. And he had passed, not by maintaining control, but by recognizing truth and accepting it fully. He often reflected on the accident as a turning point in his life. It had been brief, dramatic, and public, yet its lessons were private, deep, and enduring. The maid had spoken a few sentences, yet they had unraveled years of habit, pretense, and arrogance. The billionaire had learned that courage could come from any place, and wisdom could be found in unexpected sources. That lesson remained with him, quietly guiding his decisions, his relationships, and the way he saw the world. Years later, he would recount the story with humility and awe, not as a tale of danger or wealth, but as a story about truth and human insight. The accident, the feigned unconsciousness, and the maid's fearless honesty became the defining moment of his life, a reminder that transformation often comes from the most unlikely sources, and that life-changing wisdom is sometimes found where it is least expected. And so, the billionaire, forever altered, moved through life with a newfound respect for honesty, a deeper understanding of human character, and a quiet gratitude for a single courageous maid who had dared to speak the truth when it mattered most.